Right, so this next recipe is something which I call one song to the MIDI of another. So in the first recipe we looked at ways of making ambient music very quickly, and this is an approach for making an album of rhythmic music in under 2.5 hours. So again, we're going to use Reaper, and then we're going to need about 6 or 7, about an album's worth of MIDI files, and an album's worth of music or samples or sounds. So for example here I've got a load of MIDI files, I've downloaded a load of ABBA MIDI files from one of the various places on the internet where you can download free MIDI files, and then I've got an album of music here as well, which I'm sure you can find one of them somewhere. So this is a process of taking a MIDI file and a song and then just smashing them together to make a new piece. Like our previous project, we'll drag all of our content into one big project and then export individual tracks from the album out at the end. So here we go. So the first thing I need you to do is to get your folder with your MIDI files in, and then I need you to drag the MIDI files into your project. When you drag in a MIDI file into your project, you should have a couple of question boxes that come up. Just ignore them, hit OK, and then what you should get now is a load of information dropped in. So these are all MIDI channels. So it's a load of MIDI information here. So currently if you press play, nothing will happen. It's just information. So somebody has transcribed this tune, this ABBA song, and various different channels are playing various different instruments on it. If you're very lucky, they'll end up getting labelled up on the channel names themselves. And if not, you might just have to figure out roughly what they are. So basically what we need to do is drag an album's worth of MIDI in like this. So each MIDI item we drag in, we'll put after the next one and at the bottom down here like this. So what you get is one song's worth of MIDI files up here, one song's worth of MIDI files down here, and then repeat the process with all your MIDI files. Okay, so when you're finished you should have a project which looks like this. So multiple lumps of tracks all together across, going diagonally down. So what we're going to do with these MIDI files, so for each one of these MIDI files we're going to create a virtual instrument which is going to be a sampler. So there's a very nice easy to use sampler called Sampler-Matic on Reaper, which you can just load in and then drag and drop samples onto. So for example, if I create a Recipie plugin for this top channel here, which seems to have some sort of MIDI information in it, I can then drag and drop some music straight onto that. And then if I just go to the mode section here on the plugin and change that to note semitone shifted, the notes here in the MIDI information will now play that song as if it's a sample. So you might also want to hit the obey note offs switch here, just to make sure that notes actually turn off, so you don't just get a chaos noise of samples going off. So now what you should have is a piece of MIDI from one track being played by the other. So the game now is for each MIDI song which you've dropped into the project, you need to add a sampler to each one of these instrument channels, and in each one drop a different variation of samplage from that track. So you've got one track which will just, track one of the MIDI files will just have track one of your files of audio as a source for sampling. So what you should have now is for each track a sort of in tune musical cacophony of samplage. Which doesn't really sound like either of the tunes anymore. We've got no drums so far, so let's just have a quick look at MIDI and drums. So if you're lucky enough to have a MIDI track which has been clearly labelled, you'll probably find that there's a channel on here which says drums. And with that channel you can obviously just find yourself a plugin which can do some drum sounds, and then just sync them up to get some drum sounds on the top. Sometimes people don't label their MIDI files properly, so you might have to go digging for it. So here's a good example. This song hasn't been given a labelling system, so we've got a load of MIDI elements. How do we know which one is the drums? So looking at it closely, one way of finding out which ones the drums are would be to look at the shape of the MIDI. So generally musical notes and phrases have got this sort of up and down and this large variation in pattern. But drum files tend to be a little bit more straight and a little bit more flat. So you can see this file right here, I suspect this is a drum file. So let's load a drum VST into this channel instead. So you might find that once you load your drum VST in, there's no sound coming out of the channel. So that might be because your drum information has been transposed to a different pitch to what your VST is expecting. So people try and have the drum kit laid out in the same way over MIDI instruments, kick drum on C, snare drum on D, and so on. But sometimes there seems to be octave-based differences. So if you're in a situation where you've added a drum VST to what you think is some drum information and nothing is coming out, that might be the case. So you might need just to get into your piano roll and just transpose your drum information until you find the right home for it. There it is. So now in a very short amount of time you've got yourself a completely new arrangement of a song made out of 2 songs. I mean, that's just about music, isn't it? Pretty much say that that is music. So using this process you can do this to the next song and the next song and the next song until you've got yourself a set of very, very squonky sounding music. This might take you half an hour perhaps. And so what do you do with the next hour and a half? Well, I guess you get into your samples and maybe try and make some of them sound a bit less squonky. Start adding some processing, some effects to things. And then that's it. That's an album's worth of music in an hour. Get it rendered out. So there's a couple of albums released on Utililux which have been made this way. There's an album called Meshuggah vs Half Out the Hilton, which is this. There's an album called Kinetsukuri, which has been done in this way. There's an album called Spamwangler Plays the Music of Napalm Death. So these are all albums which have just taken one group of MIDI songs and one group of audio and then just smashed them together. It's a little bit more fiddly than the last one, this, but then we're dealing with rhythmic elements and melodic elements, so there's obviously challenges of sort of mangling keys together and trying to get things to sound ordinary. But as a sort of very quick way of just smashing together some bits to make some music, I think it's with a bit of practice, it can be a way of making music really, really fast. Do it.